Great. Thank you, Carla. Morning, everyone. And yes, so as Carla said, I'm looking at ecological integrity and recreation impacts in our state parks. And I'm in the position of being both a scientist and land manager. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about bridging those two worlds in how we're looking at our parks management. Next, please. So to set the stage a little bit about our state parks, so this is a map of all of the public lands in the state of Washington, and by far the largest public lands manager are the federal agencies, as you can see in that teal green color or sage green color, followed by the Washington Department of Natural Resources that you see in the kind of teal blue color, and then the Department of Fish and Wildlife in the orangey brown color. And state parks really is a distant fourth in public lands management, having only about 140,000 acres distributed throughout the state in the red. Most of our properties are relatively small and isolated. They tend to be at the low to mid elevations. And so, when you consider the actual magnitude of our land management, relatively small. Next, please. But when you consider the resources that we manage, it really is kind of an outsized importance in terms of significance and rarity. So more than 10% of state parks acreage is significant habitat supporting rare plants, animals, or both, such as the western snowy plover that you see there at the bottom. 40% of our parks support ecosystems that are at severe to moderate risk of extirpation at the state or global level, such as the grassland up there in the upper corner of the screen. And we manage nearly all remaining low to mid elevation old growth forests in the state of Washington. Next, please. So in order to get a better sense of how we can manage these systems, about 20 years ago, we started cataloging all the different vegetation communities that we have within our parks. And more recently, we started to measure the ecological integrity of these systems. Ecological integrity is defined as the structure, composition, function, and connectivity of an ecosystem operating within the bounds of natural or historic disturbance regimes. So we're just talking about fire. So in the case of a prairie system, we would consider human-caused fires to be part of that historic disturbance regime, since it's necessary to maintain them, similar with fires in some of our forest communities. But in other cases, recreation impacts, disturbance from development, and noxious weeds would be contributing to a loss of ecological integrity. Next, please. So we've been working with the Washington Natural Heritage Program to measure ecological integrity across the parks within our system. This is an example of a recent assessment that was done at Miller Peninsula State Park, which is on the Olympic Peninsula. And what we get out of this, so there's 3 different levels at which you can measure ecological integrity. At the highest level, kind of more of a landscape level, is basically a desk mapping exercise called a level 1 assessment. At the more intensive level, you have a level 3 assessment that is really quantitative, a little bit more time consuming. We're conducting level 2 assessments. We're conducting these at the ecological systems level of a plant community. And they are relatively rapid field assessments. They're semi-quantitative, qualitative assessments, which I'll get into, but they are repeatable. You can train people on how to conduct these assessments and get the same results over time. And so when we do this assessment, what we end up with is a map that has different assessment scores associated with each of the different polygons of plant communities or ecological systems. As you can see here, we had a few communities that were rated to be in excellent condition or an A. That's in the blue. About 30% of the park, the plant communities or ecological systems were rated to be in a good condition, or the B scores, that's in green. And then about 30 to 40% was in a fair, moderate condition, or the C scores, which is there in orange. Next, please. But really the strength of using the ecological integrity assessment is that it's not only telling you overall what the status of these plant communities is it gives you different scores for the different factors that then roll up to that overall score. So as a manager, it gives you more information that you can use to manage and monitor to. Next, please. So delving into this in just a little bit more detail. So for each major ecological factor, for example, vegetation here, you have a series of metrics. And then for each of those metrics, we've defined what the reference target condition, what that excellent integrity would be without these external impacts. And then we have different set standards for what a good integrity, the B, fair integrity, C, or poor integrity, or D, would be. And the strength of this is that it gives you more information so that instead of thinking about, all we can do is restore back to a reference condition, but we can potentially better assign what the best attainable conditions are for our management context. So, for example, we may not think that it's possible to get to less than 1% invasive species in the system. So we might set our attainable target to be for the invasive species non-native cover 1 to 4% or a B level rating. Next, please. So when we look at the ecological nutrition within our state parks from both our most recent ecological integrity assessments and our previous vegetation surveys, what we've found is that we have about 30% of the areas within our parks that are managed for natural lands that are in the good to excellent condition. About 30% are in a fair or moderate condition, the B to C, and about 40% of them are in a somewhat degraded condition. And what we have determined, next please, is that we need to maintain the areas that are in good to excellent condition, that A to B ranking. We're going to look at restoring the areas that are in the somewhat degraded condition, so that BC to C condition. And given resources, as we all know, we never have enough resources for natural lands management. The ones that are more severely degraded are not going to be a high priority for us. However, if they have a rare species or a rare plant community, we are going to prioritize those for management. And what we can do is we can use this baseline information that we collecting on the ecological integrity, both to help guide what are the different metrics that we need to be improving for management in the future, as well as a way to monitor what our success in meeting these objectives is. Next, please. So coming back around to what that definition of ecological integrity is it's really, again, talking about what is the condition and functioning of an ecological system. And while it indicates that there are some external pressures that are impacting it, it doesn't give us exact information on exactly what those different conditions are. It's also more focused on the plant community and may not be appropriate for some of the other questions we have, such as how are our parks doing in providing habitat for different wildlife species. Next, please. And this is particularly important since, as I said, we're at the low to mid elevation. We have relatively high levels of recreation within our parks. And there have been a number of studies that have been done that have shown that, in general, when you look across recreation types, such as a study that was published by Larson et al. In 2016, we find that when they do look at the impacts of recreation on wildlife, especially on the snow-based and terrestrial recreation types, the majority of studies that have looked at that kind of recreation have found an overall negative impact of recreation on wildlife species. So that's the blue color within those horizontal bars. And while some studies have found unclear results, which are kind of those clear areas within the end of those bars, only a very few have ever found positive impacts of recreation on wildlife. And when we look to see what those impacts are, next please, we see that species tend to respond, such as what was found by Nadeau and Burton in 2020 up in BC. We find that species tend to either shift their activities in space. So you can see that across this variety of species that they looked at for hikers and horseback riders, they shifted their activity in space, and even greater shifts were found for motorized and mountain bike activities. Next, please. Or they shift their activity in time. So on the x-axis there, you see the nocturnality of a species, and the green dots are their activity under low human disturbance. And for nearly every species that they looked at, they found that there was an overall shift in becoming more nocturnal when there's high levels of human disturbance. this not only impacts the individual species that they're looking at, it also impacts potentially other aspects of the ecosystem, such as when they looked at coyotes, they were finding that they were shifting to preying on different, more nocturnal prey species. Next, please. So this became a particular interest for us because we've had a shift in activities in our parks. Any of us who are managing natural lands have seen that this huge increase in recreation over the past several years that has dipped down just a little bit since we came out of COVID lockdown, but really hasn't gone back down to pre-COVID levels. In addition, we're seeing proposals for new kinds of events, such as this 200-mile endurance race that would have occurred over 5 days and 4 nights. Next, please. Just a sheer increase in the number of activities that people are proposing and requesting permits to have within our parks, including this event that occurs at dusk, which might be one of those safe spaces for different wildlife species. Next, please. And as well, we're just seeing, as I mentioned, increased levels of visitor usage and people using our parks in different time periods, such as riding mountain bikes at night with lights, even though our parks are closed to those kinds of activities at night. Next, please. So we know that recreation happens in our parks, and we assume that recreation is having an impact. But what we were concerned about, again, was, are these shifts in activity and the different kinds of activities having an additional impact on the wildlife in our parks? Next, please. But to really answer this question, we first had to answer the question of what wildlife are present, where are the wildlife, and when are they active? Next. In order to answer this question, we've started a wildlife camera study in 11 of our parks. And this is an example of one of those parks. In order to distribute the cameras within the parks, in order to answer this question, we ended up using Strava heat maps. So Strava is an activity tracker. Users upload the data from their different activity devices like Garmin's or Suntos, and these heat maps show relative levels of recreation from these human collected data. And next, please. What we found is that when we look at the relative levels of use from those heat maps to actual major levels of use, we find pretty good relationship, so that data from Strava showing relatively high level of use, we actually are counting relatively high numbers of people. And this suggests that forest land managers, these Strava heat maps can be a good indicator of where we're seeing these relatively high recreation patterns. Next, please. And while we're still collecting and counting all the images from our camera images, next, please. We're already getting some really valuable results, such as the finding of several fissures at one of our parks. Next, please. And I'm briefly going to lay out that we are looking for your help. If you're a land manager and interested in participating in this research, our graduate student is currently conducting interviews of land managers to better understand to what level we're using science in land management. And Marcella's contact is there, or you can reach out to me. Next, please. And we're also using this information to help inform a multi-agency and tribal effort to understand the recreation impacts on land management. Next. So thank you. I know I went through a lot of information without very many details, but I just wanted to let you know a few more tools that are out there. So please, I'll answer any questions in the chat, and please feel free to reach out to me with any additional questions. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Andrea. That's great. Great to know that Washington Parks is doing this. I wonder if Oregon Park is embark on anything similar. Maybe they'll be inspired by this to do so. We do have a couple questions in the chat, so I will read them for you, and then maybe we'll get to mine. So the first question we have for you is, someone would like to know who or what informed the conditions to meet the integrity index / metric rating were tribes involved with creating the rating system for their ancestral lands?
Yes, that's a great question. So the Nature Serve Network, so the series of natural heritage programs, were the ones that determined what are the qualities for those reference standard vegetation communities. So it was groups of scientists. I know that they incorporate it. So it's not based off of a specific place metric, but based off of that plant community information. And I would definitely encourage you to look at the Natural Heritage Program's webpage that provides a much better background on how those metrics were determined.
Yeah. The next question is, I see you look at plant species to determine ecological integrity. Do you consider the lichen and bryophyte communities to determine ecological integrity? These include biological soil crusts and such.
So because of the type of, it's supposed to be an assessment that could be relatively easily considered. In general, I think lichens and bryophytes aren't part of the plant community other than looking at, is that community, the lichens and bryophytes were appropriate intact. However, it depends on the system, right? So it may not be as important in some of the communities other than looking at, is that structure present? But certainly in a sage steppe community, they are looking to see, is there an intact soil crust community? So not looking, I guess, at the species level, but looking at the presence of that group within. So they are considered as kind of a functional group.
Alrighty. There is another question. I don't know if this is in your purview to answer, but someone's wondering about the homeless problems in state parks.
Yeah, so the homeless problem in state parks is typically an issue that we have within some of the more developed campgrounds, and that's managed within our operations program. It's not an issue that we're typically seeing impacting the natural lands. So I think it is something that I hesitate to use the word problem. It is an issue that is managed within the parks. That is something that we deal with, but we don't see, in part because our parks tend to be relatively small, we don't see a whole lot of encampments within the park. So it's something that's happening within the developed campground spaces.
Okay. And is Washington State Parks sharing their Fisher detection data with WDFW?
We are, yes. We are very happy to be able to provide that information.
That's an easy one. My quick question, I'm curious, do you know if this has been completed for Cape Disappointment or Fort Columbia State Parks?
We do have some data for Cape Disappointment. So yeah, I'd be happy to chat with you about what we have.
Cool, yeah, I'd love to see that. I'll follow up with you on that. Another question just came in. What other sources outside of the Natural Heritage Program are helpful for this type of research?
So there are a couple of broad topics that I covered. So ecological integrity assessments, really, that is a Natural Heritage Program / Nature Share of Initiative. And so they're really the best source for that. For the wildlife studies, there's a lot of data and research that are out there. If you want it looks like Allie, if you're interested in any of those sources, please reach out to me and I can give you kind of my list of references that I work off of.
Okay, well, great. Thank you so much, Andrea.